The Shadow Beyond the Speakeasy. New York City, 1925. The rain had just stopped, leaving the cobblestone streets slick with water and glistening under the dim light of street lamps. The muffled clatter of carriages, the distant hum of automobiles, and the rhythmic clink of boot heels echoed through the alleys of Midtown. The Pendleton Hotel towered above it all, regal building with grand arches, polished brass doors, and a revolving door that never stopped spinning. Inside, guests indulged in luxuries most Americans could only dream of, sipping tea from fine porcelain and dining beneath chandeliers that sparkled like constellations. Thomas Whitaker knew this world well. He navigated it with the practiced ease of a man who had seen everything and judged nothing. His job as a waiter at the Pendleton wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough to keep him in a modest boarding house and gave him access to tips from the wealthiest pockets in the city. But Thomas had another life. When his shift ended at midnight, he didn't go home like the other staff. Instead, he slipped out through the back entrance of the hotel, his white shirt untucked and his bow tie hanging loosely around his neck. He moved quickly through the narrow alleys, weaving through the shadows until he reached an unmarked door with peeling paint. Behind that door was the shadow clover. The speakeasy was a haven for those who lived in defiance of the law. Jazz bands played nightly, their melodies weaving through the cigarette smoke that hung heavy in the air. The patrons were a mix of flappers in sequin dresses, businessmen who had lost fortunes in the stock market, and the occasional politician looking to escape the scrutiny of the press. The room itself was dark and intimate, with walls lined in rich mahogany and mirrors that reflected the warm glow of candlelight. At the center of it all was the bar, a crescent-shaped counter where Thomas worked most nights. He liked the shadow clover. It was chaotic, yes, but it was alive. It was a place where the rules of the outside world didn't apply, where people could lose themselves in the music, the drinks, and the moment. But tonight felt different. It started when the man walked in. Thomas noticed him immediately, not because he was loud or flashy, but because he was the opposite. He moved through the crowd with an unnatural stillness, his dark suit and hat blending into the shadows. The fabric of his suit shimmered faintly, catching the light in a way that didn't seem possible. When the man reached the bar, he didn't order a drink. Instead, he leaned in close and said 3 words that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. "The clock ticks." Thomas blinked, his hand pausing mid-pour. "Excuse me," he said, but the man was already gone, disappearing into the crowd as if he had never been there. Shaking off the encounter, Thomas returned to his work. The hours passed in a blur of clinking glasses, laughter, and the steady rhythm of jazz. By 2 a.m., the speakeasy had emptied out, and the band was packing up their instruments. Thomas stayed behind to clean up, the soft hum of silence settling over the room. He worked methodically, stacking glasses and wiping down the bar, his thoughts drifting back to the strange man and his cryptic message. That's when it happened. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching unnaturally high before extinguishing all at once, plunging the room into darkness. Thomas froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him like a physical weight. A low hum filled the room, so faint at first that he thought he was imagining it. But it grew louder, resonating in his bones, until it was all he could hear. And then he saw it. In the center of the room, where the patrons had danced just hours before, a dark shape began to form. It wasn't smoke, and it wasn't shadow. It was something deeper, something that seemed to devour the light around it. The shape twisted and writhed, expanding outward. The hum in the air turned into a deafening roar, and Thomas stumbled backward, clamping his hands over his ears. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the swirling void that now dominated the room. And then as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence was absolute, the kind that pressed against his ears and made his head throb. The air was still, the room dark. When Thomas opened his eyes, the shadow clover was gone. The bar, the tables, the mirrors, the candles, everything had vanished. He was standing in an empty space, surrounded by darkness so complete it felt like the end of the world. But it wasn't the end. A faint light appeared in the distance, growing brighter with each passing second. It wasn't a warm light, like a flame or a sunrise. It was cold, blue, and artificial. Thomas took a hesitant step toward it, his footsteps echoing in the void. As he moved closer, the light resolved into a shape, a doorway. Its edges were sharp and angular, glowing faintly against the blackness. Without thinking, he reached out and touched it. The moment his fingers made contact, the world shifted. He felt like he was falling, tumbling through a void that stretched endlessly in every direction. His body twisted and turned, pulled by forces he couldn't comprehend. And then, with a jarring abruptness, it ended. Thomas stumbled forward, landing hard on his hands and knees. The ground beneath him was solid, rough, and cold. When he looked up, he realized he was no longer in the speakeasy. He was standing on a cobblestone street under a pale, gray sky. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp earth, and the buildings around him were old, their stone facades weathered by time. But something was off. The streets were empty, the windows dark. The city felt abandoned, as if it had been frozen in time. Thomas rose to his feet, his breath visible in the cold air. His heart raced as he turned in a slow circle, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. And then he saw it. In the distance, rising above the rooftops, was a clock tower. Its face was cracked, its hands frozen at midnight. The clock ticks. The man's words echoed in his mind, and a chill ran down his spine. Thomas didn't know where he was, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't in 1925 anymore. Thomas stood motionless on the cobblestone street, his breath visible in the cold, stagnant air. The world around him felt unreal, a blend of the familiar and the alien. The clock tower loomed in the distance, its cracked face and frozen hands an ominous reminder of the man's cryptic words, "The clock ticks." But here, time wasn't ticking. It felt stuck, like the city itself had been paused in some forgotten moment. The streets were eerily quiet, their emptiness amplified by the faint echo of his own footsteps as he began to walk. The buildings were old, stone facades with ornate carvings and wrought iron balconies. But the closer he looked, the stranger they became. Some structures seemed ancient, their walls crumbling with age, vines creeping up their sides. Others looked newer, with sharp, angular designs and materials he didn't recognize. Smooth, reflective surfaces that shimmered faintly in the dim light. It was as if the city was a patchwork, stitched together from different times and places. Thomas's heart pounded as he moved deeper into the city, the silence pressing against his ears. He didn't know where he was, or when, but he knew he couldn't stay in one place. Something about this place felt wrong, like it was watching him. As he turned a corner, he saw a figure in the distance. It was a woman, standing motionless in the middle of the street. Her back was to him, her long coat billowing slightly in the breeze. Relief flooded through him. "Hey," he called, his voice echoing through the empty street. The woman didn't move. Thomas hesitated, unease prickling at the back of his neck. "Are you all right?" he called again, taking a step closer. Still no response. He approached cautiously, his footsteps slow and deliberate. As he got closer, he realized something was wrong. The woman wasn't moving, not even a twitch. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. She wasn't a woman. She was a statue. Her face was frozen in an expression of terror, her hands raised as if trying to shield herself from something. Her eyes, though carved from stone, seemed almost lifelike, wide with fear. Thomas stepped back, his stomach churning. The detail was too perfect, too real. It was as if she had been alive one moment and turned to stone the next. He spun around, his eyes scanning the street. More figures stood in the distance, scattered like forgotten monuments. Each one was different. A man hunched over as if trying to run, a child clutching a toy, an old woman kneeling in prayer. All of them frozen. "What the hell is this place?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. He turned back toward the clock tower, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. Something about it drew him, like a magnet pulling at his very being. He didn't want to go there, but he knew he had to. The closer he got to the tower, the stranger the city became. The air grew colder, and the buildings around him seemed to shift and blur, their edges flickering like images on an old film reel. The streets twisted and warped, curving in impossible directions. And then there were the whispers. They started faint, barely audible over the sound of his own footsteps. But as he walked, they grew louder. Voices, overlapping and jumbled, like a crowd speaking all at once. Tick, tock, time is broken. Lost, never-ending. Thomas clutched his head, trying to block out the sound. "Stop it!" he shouted. But the voices only grew louder. He stumbled forward, his vision swimming. The clock tower loomed closer now, its cracked face glowing faintly in the gray light. The ground beneath him shifted, the cobblestones rippling like water. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath. And then, everything went silent. Thomas looked up, his chest heaving. He was at the base of the clock tower. The massive structure stretched high into the sky, its surface covered in cracks that glowed faintly with blue light. The hands of the clock were frozen at midnight, but the faint hum of machinery echoed from within, as if the tower was alive. A doorway stood before him, its heavy wooden frame carved with intricate symbols he couldn't decipher. Thomas hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Every instinct in his body told him to turn back, to run. But he couldn't. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, the faint smell of oil and metal filling his nose. The interior of the tower was nothing like he had expected. Gears the size of cars turned slowly in the dim light, their teeth grinding together with a low, mechanical groan. Tubes and wires snaked along the walls, pulsing with faint blue energy. At the center of the room was a massive pendulum, swinging back and forth with agonizing slowness. But it wasn't the machinery that caught Thomas's attention. It was the figure standing at the base of the pendulum. A man, his back to Thomas, dressed in the same strange, shimmering suit as the one from the Shadow Clover. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back. "You've made it," the man said, his voice low and calm. Thomas's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice instantly. It was the man who had whispered to him at the bar. "The clock ticks. Who are you?" Thomas demanded, his voice shaking. The man turned slowly, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "That's not the question you should be asking," he said. Thomas took a step back, his heart pounding. "What is this place?" The man tilted his head, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "This is where all broken things come to rest. Time, space, memory, they all converge here. In the shadow of the clock." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Why am I here?" The man's smile faded. "Because you are the anomaly." Thomas stared at the man before him, his breath catching in his chest. The word anomaly echoed in his mind, sharp and unsettling. The pendulum above them swung in slow, deliberate arcs, its movement casting flickering shadows across the chamber. "Anomaly?" Thomas repeated, his voice trembling. I'm just a bartender. I don't belong here. The man tilted his head slightly, his shadowed face betraying no emotion. No one belongs here, yet here we are, he said, his voice calm and deliberate. You think of yourself as ordinary, Thomas Whitaker, but the truth is far more complicated. Thomas stepped back, his mind reeling. How do you know my name? How do you know anything about me? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his shimmering suit and pulled out a small, mechanical device. It was round, no larger than a pocket watch, and its surface pulsed faintly with blue light. This, the man said, holding it up, is how we found you. It's how we find all anomalies. Thomas frowned, confusion and fear swirling inside him. What does that even mean? What am I doing here? The man's grip on the device tightened, his tone growing more serious. Time is not a straight line, Thomas. It is a fragile, looping thread that stretches across dimensions, intersecting itself in ways most cannot comprehend. Every so often, a thread phrase breaks and creates something unexpected. That's what you are, a fracture, a break in the weave of time. Thomas's stomach churned. I didn't do anything. I didn't break anything. You didn't have to, the man said. You were born this way, a living paradox. Your very existence defies the natural order. And now, the clock has brought you here, to the shadow nexus. Thomas felt his knees weaken. The clock? You mean that thing? He gestured to the massive pendulum and the frozen hands high above them. The man nodded. The clock governs all timelines. It anchors reality, keeps the threads from unraveling. But when an anomaly like you exists, it destabilizes everything. The clock is trying to fix the timeline, Thomas. Fix it? Thomas's voice rose, panic creeping in. How? The man's silence spoke volumes. No, Thomas said, shaking his head. No, you're lying. This can't be real. The man took a step closer, his presence imposing. The longer you deny it, the worse the consequences will be. Look around you, Thomas. Do you see what's happening to this city? The frozen figures, the collapsing streets. This is what happens when an anomaly is left unchecked. Time devours itself. Thomas's mind raced. The stone statues he'd passed on the street, the strange whispers, the crumbling buildings, they all seemed to align with the man's words. But none of it made sense. There has to be another way, Thomas said, his voice desperate. There isn't, the man replied coldly. The only way to restore balance is to remove the anomaly from the equation. Thomas's blood ran cold. You mean to kill me? The man's expression didn't change. It's not personal, Thomas. It's the only way to save the timeline. Thomas's survival instincts kicked in. He stepped back, his eyes darting around the chamber for an escape route. But the room seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls shifting and pulsing like a living thing. The man sighed, as though tired of the conversation. Running won't help. The clock will always find you. It's better if you accept your fate. But Thomas wasn't listening. His gaze had landed on something across the chamber. Another device, identical to the one the man held, resting on a pedestal beneath the pendulum. It glowed faintly, its light pulsing in sync with the swing of the pendulum. An idea sparked in his mind. What happens if I destroy the clock? He asked, his voice steady now. The man's expression darkened. Don't even think about it. Thomas took another step back, edging closer to the pedestal. If the clock controls time, then maybe breaking it will fix everything. Destroying the clock would destabilize the entire timeline, the man said sharply. It would unravel everything. Thomas, past, present, and future. Billions of lives, gone in an instant. Do you really want that on your conscience? Thomas hesitated, his heart pounding. He didn't want to destroy everything. But he couldn't let himself be sacrificed either. "There has to be another way," he said, more to himself than to the man. "There isn't," the man repeated, his tone final. "You have a choice, Thomas. Accept your fate or doom us all." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I don't trust you." The man opened his mouth to reply, but Thomas didn't wait. He turned and sprinted toward the pedestal, his shoes pounding against the metal floor. "Stop!" the man shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. Thomas didn't stop. He reached the pedestal and grabbed the glowing device, its surface warm and humming beneath his fingers. The moment he lifted it, the entire room trembled. The pendulum above him swung violently, its movement growing faster and more erratic. Sparks erupted from the gears lining the walls, and the blue energy coursing through the tubes began to flicker. "You have no idea what you're doing," the man shouted, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. Thomas gritted his teeth and held the device tightly. "Neither do you." And then, without another thought, he slammed the device against the pedestal, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The effect was immediate. The pendulum froze mid-swing, its glowing light extinguished. The hum of machinery ceased, plunging the room into an eerie silence. And then, the world around him began to dissolve. The walls of the chamber crumbled into ash, the floor beneath his feet disintegrating into nothingness. The clock tower, the city, the man. Everything dissolved into a swirling void of light and darkness. Thomas felt himself falling, tumbling through the void as time itself unraveled around him. Flashes of the past, present, and future surged past him. Memories, moments, fragments of lives he didn't recognize. He didn't know where he was going, or if he would even survive. All he knew was that he had made his choice. Thomas drifted in the void, his body weightless, his senses overwhelmed by the kaleidoscope of light and sound that surrounded him. Time unraveled in every direction, fragments of history colliding and merging in a chaotic dance. He saw empires rise and fall, civilizations reduced to ashes, and the faces of countless people, some familiar, some not, flashing before his eyes. And then, the fall ended. With a jarring abruptness, Thomas hit solid ground. He gasped, his lungs burning as if he had held his breath for hours. The air was still, the silence deafening. Slowly, he sat up, his hands brushing against the surface beneath him. It was smooth and cold, like polished stone. When he looked around, he found himself in an endless expanse of white. There were no walls, no horizon, no landmarks, just an infinite, blinding void. He was alone. Thomas's chest tightened as the weight of his decision settled over him. He had shattered the device, disrupted the clock, and unleashed chaos upon the timeline. And now, where am I? He whispered, his voice trembling. As if in response, the air shimmered before him, and a figure began to form. It was the man from the clock tower, his shimmering suit and wide-brimmed hat untouched by the destruction. "You," Thomas said, scrambling to his feet. "What's going on? What happened to the clock?" The man's expression was unreadable. "You broke it," he said simply. "Time, as we know it, no longer exists." Thomas's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I thought—" He trailed off, his mind racing. "I thought breaking the clock would fix things." The man tilted his head, his tone almost pitying. "You were warned. The clock wasn't the problem, Thomas. It was the solution. It kept the threads of reality in balance, no matter how many anomalies appeared. Without it," he gestured to the void around them. "This is what's left," the man said. "The fragments of time. A blank slate." Thomas took a step back, his heart pounding. No, this can't be right. You're lying." "I gain nothing from lying," the man said. "You wanted control. Now you have it. Thomas's breathing quickened as the enormity of what he had done began to sink in. The city, the people, the timelines, all of it was gone. He had destroyed everything in his desperate attempt to save himself. Is there a way to fix it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man studied him for a long moment. Perhaps, he said finally, but it would come at a cost. What cost? The man stepped closer, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the blank expanse. You've become untethered from time, Thomas. A living anomaly in an empty void. If you want to restore the timeline, you must anchor it again. Bind yourself to it. Thomas frowned. How? You would become the clock, the man said. An eternal anchor, keeping the threads of time in balance. But it is not a life. You would exist outside of time, outside of reality, watching, waiting, ensuring the threads remain intact. Thomas's mouth went dry. And if I don't? Then this void is all that remains, the man said. A timeless limbo, where nothing grows, nothing changes, and nothing lives. Your existence here would mean nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. Thomas closed his eyes, memories flashing through his mind. The smoky warmth of the shadow clover, the buzz of the Pendleton Hotel, the vibrant chaos of New York City in the 1920s. He thought of the people he had served, the faces of the frozen statues, the crumbling city streets. He had made a choice to save himself once, and it had cost him everything. He couldn't make the same mistake again. Thomas opened his eyes, his jaw tightening. How do I become the clock? The man's expression softened, a flicker of approval crossing his face. Step forward. Thomas obeyed, his footsteps echoing faintly against the void. As he approached, the ground beneath him began to shift, gears and cogs rising from the white expanse. The air hummed with energy, and a faint, rhythmic ticking filled the silence. The man stepped aside, revealing a glowing sphere suspended in midair. It pulsed with a warm, golden light, radiating a quiet power that seemed to resonate deep within Thomas's chest. This is the heart of the clock, the man said. Touch it, and your essence will bind to the threads of time. You will become the anchor. Thomas hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the sphere. What happens to me? You will exist, the man said simply, and nothing more. Thomas took a deep breath, his mind racing. He thought of the people he could save, the lives that could be restored, the timeline that could be rebuilt. And then, without another word, he touched the sphere. The moment his fingers made contact, the world exploded into light. Thomas felt his body dissolve, his consciousness expanding outward in every direction. He became aware of the threads of time, stretching infinitely across dimensions, their colors vibrant and alive. He could feel the weight of the timeline, the delicate balance of past, present, and future. He was no longer Thomas Whitaker. He was the clock. As the light faded, the void transformed. The gears and cogs around him clicked into place, forming the structure of the clock tower once more. The pendulum swung steadily, its rhythmic ticking a comforting reminder of order restored. The city began to reappear, its streets and buildings rebuilding themselves piece by piece. The frozen figures returned to life, their movements fluid and natural. Time was whole again, but Thomas was gone. In the quiet heart of the clock tower, the pendulum swung, and the gears turned. The city below thrived, its people oblivious to the sacrifice that had saved them. And in the steady, eternal rhythm of the clock, the faintest whisper could be heard. The clock ticks. The Stone Gate. The wind howled across the barren hills of the Scottish Highlands, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and heather. Miles of untouched wilderness stretched in every direction, the rolling landscape broken only by jagged rocks and the occasional lone tree bent under the weight of centuries. Miriam Grant crouched at the base of an ancient stone monolith, brushing her gloved fingers across the weathered carvings etched into its surface. The symbols were unfamiliar, their shapes twisting and interlocking like a labyrinth of language long lost to time. She glanced up at the cloudy sky, the light fading fast, and then back at the stone. It stood over 12 feet tall, its surface pitted and scarred, yet its presence felt imposing, even in its age. This was no ordinary marker, she thought. This was something more. Miriam had spent the better part of a decade chasing myths and folklore, piecing together scraps of evidence about the so-called stone gates, ancient monoliths scattered across the world, rumored to be portals to something beyond. Scholars dismissed them as nothing more than primitive artifacts, relics of cultures seeking to explain the unknown. But Miriam knew better. The expedition that had led her here, to this remote corner of Scotland, had been sparked by a fragment of an old manuscript she'd uncovered in a Parisian archive. The text, written in Latin, spoke of a doorway of stars hidden among the stones, a place where the boundaries between worlds blurred. Her guide, Angus MacColl, stood a few paces behind her, shifting uneasily from foot to foot. He was a grizzled man in his 60s, with a thick accent and an even thicker coat that barely seemed to keep out the cold. "We should leave soon, Miss Grant," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "The weather's turning, and these hills aren't kind to travelers after dark." "Just a moment," Miriam replied, her focus unwavering. She traced the lines of one particular carving, a spiral surrounded by what looked like a constellation of stars. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a notebook, flipping to a page where she'd sketched the same symbol from the manuscript. It was a perfect match. Her pulse quickened. "This is it," she whispered to herself, but as she leaned in closer, the wind seemed to shift, carrying with it a faint sound, something rhythmic, almost musical. It wasn't the wind or the rustle of the heather. It was something else. "Miriam," Angus called again, his voice tinged with worry. "We really must go. Now." She ignored him, stepping closer to the stone. The sound grew louder, resonating in her chest like a heartbeat. She placed her hand on the cold surface, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The carvings beneath her palm began to glow, faint at first, then brighter. A low hum filled the air, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. Angus cursed behind her, but his words were drowned out as the monolith flared with light, blinding in its intensity. Miriam stumbled back, shielding her eyes. When the light faded, she opened her eyes to find that the stone had changed. The spiral at its center was no longer carved into the surface. It was open, a doorway. For a moment, Miriam forgot how to breathe. The spiral glowed faintly, its edges shimmering like liquid mercury. Beyond it, the air seemed to ripple, distorting the landscape on the other side. She took a tentative step closer, her heart pounding. The hum in the air was almost deafening now, vibrating through her bones. "Miriam, don't," Angus warned, his voice sharp. "You don't know what you're dealing with." She glanced back at him, her mind racing. "This is what I've been searching for, Angus. All these years, it's real. Don't you see?" "That's the problem," he said, his face pale. "Some things are real for a reason. They're meant to stay that way, untouched." But Miriam couldn't stop herself. This was it. Proof. The culmination of years of work, countless sleepless nights, and endless ridicule from her peers. She couldn't walk away now. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they passed through the glowing spiral. The air felt cool and electric, like static before a storm. And then, with a deep breath, she stepped through. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The wind died, replaced by an eerie stillness. The ground beneath her feet felt solid, but it wasn't earth or stone. It was smooth and reflective, like black glass. Miriam looked around, her breath catching in her throat. She was no longer in the highlands. The sky above her was a swirling canvas of colors, deep purples, vibrant blues, and streaks of gold that seemed to move like liquid. Strange, jagged formations jutted out of the ground, their surfaces glimmering faintly in the surreal light. In the distance, towering structures rose into the sky, their shapes impossible and otherworldly. They looked like cities, but their angles were wrong, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere alien. Her instincts told her to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the world she knew. But the doorway was gone. The stone monolith she had stepped through now stood behind her, dark and lifeless. Its carvings faded as if they had never glowed at all. Panic bubbled in her chest. "No, no, no," she muttered, running her hands over the cold surface of the stone. It didn't respond. She was trapped. As the reality of her situation sank in, the rhythmic hum returned, louder and more insistent. Miriam turned, her eyes scanning the strange landscape. In the distance, a figure emerged. It moved with an unnatural grace, its tall, elongated form shimmering like the air around it. Its features were indistinct, its body a blur of light and shadow. Miriam froze, every instinct screaming at her to hide, to run, to do anything but stand there. But her legs refused to move. The figure stopped a few feet away, its presence overwhelming. It tilted its head, as though studying her, and then, without a sound, it raised a hand, or what passed for one, and pointed at her. The hum grew deafening, and the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Miriam's vision blurred as the world around her twisted and fractured, and the last thing she heard before everything went black was the voice of the figure. It wasn't a sound. It was in her mind, a single word that echoed through her consciousness. Unwelcome. Miriam's consciousness returned slowly, like a swimmer surfacing from deep water. Her eyes fluttered open to a dim, alien light that filtered through the swirling skies above. The rhythmic hum that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. She lay on her back, the smooth, glassy ground beneath her reflecting the fractured sky. Her body ached, though she couldn't tell if it was from the fall or something deeper, something more unnatural. When she sat up, she realized she wasn't where she had been. The towering structures in the distance were gone, replaced by a barren expanse of black glass that stretched endlessly in every direction. There were no jagged formations here, no otherworldly monuments, just emptiness. Miriam stood, her legs unsteady, and turned in a slow circle. The stone monolith was nowhere to be seen. Her pulse quickened as panic set in. The doorway, her tether to the world she knew, was gone. She was truly alone. Her breathing grew shallow as she tried to calm herself. She reached into her satchel out of habit, her fingers brushing against the leather-bound notebook that had guided her here. Clutching it tightly, she opened it to the page with the spiral symbol, hoping for some kind of clue. The ink had smudged. Her heart sank as she realized that many of the pages had become illegible. The careful sketches and notes she had spent years compiling now distorted and faded. Only fragments of words and symbols remained, scattered like puzzle pieces without context. Her grip tightened on the notebook. "Think, Miriam," she whispered to herself. "You've gotten this far. There has to be a way out." She began to walk, her boots clicking softly against the reflective ground. The silence was oppressive, amplifying every sound she made. Her shadow stretched long and thin behind her, distorted by the unnatural light. As she walked, the stillness began to feel alive, as though the landscape itself was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, convinced that something was following her, though the emptiness stretched endlessly in every direction. And then she saw it, a faint glimmer of light on the horizon, barely distinguishable from the swirling hues of the sky. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, and Miriam felt an inexplicable pull toward it. With no other options, she adjusted her satchel and headed toward the light. The journey was disorienting. The landscape seemed to shift around her, the distance to the light growing and shrinking unpredictably. At times, she felt as though she were walking in circles, the black glass beneath her rippling faintly as if it were water. But she pressed on, driven by equal parts determination and desperation. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed before she reached the source of the light. It was another stone monolith, smaller than the one in the highlands but identical in its design. Its surface was carved with the same spiraling symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. Unlike the first monolith, this one was cracked, its edges jagged and uneven. Miriam approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached out to touch it, a voice echoed in her mind. "Seeker." She froze, her hand hovering inches from the stone. The voice wasn't human. It was layered, resonating with a depth that made her bones vibrate. "You have crossed the threshold," the voice continued, its tone both commanding and distant. "You are not welcome here." "I didn't mean to cross," Miriam said aloud, her voice shaking. "I didn't know. I didn't know this would happen." There was a long pause, the silence stretching unnaturally. "You are a fragment," the voice said at last. "A disruption. The gate was not meant for you." Miriam's brow furrowed. "The gate? You mean the monolith? What is it? What is this place?" The voice did not answer her questions directly. Instead, it said, "The stone gates are anchors, threads between worlds. To open one is to disturb the balance." Miriam's breath caught. "Balance? Between what?" "Realities," the voice replied. "Worlds that exist parallel to your own, separated by barriers that were never meant to be crossed. You have breached those barriers. You are a threat." "I didn't know," Miriam said, her voice rising. "I was just—" "Intent does not matter," the voice interrupted. "The disruption must be corrected." Before Miriam could respond, the monolith flared with light, and the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The landscape shifted violently, the black glass cracking and splitting like ice under pressure. Miriam stumbled, falling to her knees as the air grew thick with energy. The monolith before her pulsed erratically, its cracks widening as arcs of light erupted from its surface. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. When Miriam looked up, she was no longer alone. Figures surrounded her, their forms tall and angular, their bodies composed of light and shadow. Their faces were indistinct, shifting like smoke, but their presence was overwhelming. They stared at her without eyes, their heads tilting in unison. Miriam's heart pounded. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "We are the Wardens," one of the figures said, its voice echoing in her mind. "Guardians of the threads, protectors of the balance." "What do you want from me?" "You must be removed," another warden said. "Your presence disrupts the equilibrium." "You are an anomaly." Miriam staggered to her feet, her fists clenched. "I didn't ask to be here. I didn't mean to disrupt anything." "Your intentions are irrelevant," the first warden said. "The gates cannot remain open. Your thread must be severed." Miriam's blood ran cold. "Severed? You will be unmade," the warden replied. "Your existence removed from the threads of reality." Panic surged through her. "No," she said, shaking her head. There has to be another way. I can fix this. I can close the gate. The wardens did not move, their forms flickering faintly. The gate cannot be closed by you, one of them said. You are not of this realm, but I came through it, Miriam shouted. There has to be a way back. For the first time, the wardens hesitated. Their forms shifted, their indistinct faces turning toward one another as if communicating silently. Finally, one of them spoke. There is a way, but the cost is great. What cost? Miriam asked, desperation in her voice. To restore balance, you must become the anchor. You will remain here, bound to the gate, ensuring it remains closed. You will exist outside of time, outside of reality, a guardian of the threshold. Miriam's breath caught. And if I don't? The warden's response was immediate. The fracture will spread. Your world and others will fall. The silence after the warden's proclamation was deafening. Miriam stared at the towering figures, her breath shallow, her heart hammering against her ribs. The words echoed in her mind, become the anchor. Her hands trembled as she clutched the strap of her satchel, grounding herself in its familiar weight. I'm just an archaeologist, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not a guardian or whatever you think I am. I came here to find answers, not to sacrifice myself. The wardens didn't move. Their forms shimmered faintly, like heat waves distorting the air. You misunderstand, one of them said, its voice calm but unyielding. This is not a sacrifice. This is a necessity. The threads of reality must be protected. Miriam shook her head, panic creeping into her voice. You're asking me to give up my life, to stay here, in this place, forever? There has to be another way. There is no alternative, another warden replied. The fracture is expanding. If left unchecked, it will consume not only your world but others connected to it. The gates must remain closed. Miriam's mind raced. She thought of her life back home, the cramped apartment in Edinburgh, the dusty archives she spent her days poring over, the colleagues who dismissed her as a dreamer chasing myths. She thought of her parents, long gone, and the emptiness their absence had left behind. But most of all, she thought of her work. Every discovery, every late night spent translating ancient texts, every risk she'd taken to chase the truth, it had all led her here. To this moment. What happens if I become the anchor? She asked, her voice steadier now. You will be bound to the gate, a warden replied. Your existence will become part of the fabric of this realm. You will not age, nor will you experience time as you once did. You will simply be. Miriam swallowed hard. And if I don't? The glassy ground beneath her rippled, and a faint hum filled the air. The fracture will spread, the warden said. The balance will be lost. Entire worlds will collapse into oblivion. This realm, your realm, and countless others will cease to exist. Her knees felt weak. The weight of the choice pressed down on her, suffocating. Why me? She asked, looking up at the shimmering figures. Why not one of you? We are the guardians of the threads, a warden replied. We cannot take on the burden of the anchor. The gate chose you. The gate chose me, she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. The wardens did not respond. Miriam turned away from them, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The swirling skies above and the endless expanse of black glass below stretched into infinity, a world that felt both alive and empty. She thought about the first time she had read about the stone gates, hidden among the pages of a forgotten manuscript. She had been so sure they were the key to understanding humanity's past, a link to the civilizations that had come before. She hadn't considered the consequences of opening one. Her fingers brushed against the notebook in her satchel, the pages now faded and smudged. Her life's work, her passion, felt meaningless in the face of what she had unleashed. She glanced back at the wardens, their forms towering and otherworldly, waiting for her answer. "I can't undo what I've done," she said quietly. "But if I don't do this, it'll all be for nothing. Everything I've ever cared about, everyone, will be gone." The warden said nothing, but their stillness spoke volumes. Miriam closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. Her fear, her doubts, her desperation, they all swirled within her, threatening to consume her. But beneath it all, there was resolve. She had come here seeking answers, and now she had them. She understood what the gates were, what they represented, and she understood what she had to do. When she opened her eyes, her voice was steady. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll become the anchor." The wardens moved for the first time, stepping closer in unison. Their forms shimmered brightly, their presence overwhelming. "You have chosen wisely," one of them said. "The balance will be restored." The cracked monolith behind her began to glow, its spiraling symbols flaring with light. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air grew thick with energy. Miriam took a step toward the monolith, her hands shaking. As she reached out to touch it, she paused, looking back at the wardens. "Will anyone know?" she asked. "Will anyone remember me?" "The threads remember all," a warden replied. "Your actions will resonate across the fabric of reality, though your presence will fade." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it would have to be enough. Taking a deep breath, Miriam placed her hands on the glowing stone. The light consumed her. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no sensation, no thought. And then, everything changed. Miriam felt herself expanding, her consciousness stretching beyond the confines of her body. She became aware of the threads, the delicate, interwoven strands of reality that connected worlds, timelines, and dimensions. She could feel the fracture, the damage her actions had caused, and the slow, steady process of repair as the threads realigned. She was no longer Miriam Grant. She was the anchor. The swirling skies above the alien landscape began to calm, their colors softening. The cracked monolith repaired itself, its glowing symbols fading into stillness. The black glass of the ground shimmered briefly before solidifying, a smooth, unbroken surface. The wardens stepped back, their forms fading into the ether. The realm grew silent once more, the balance restored. And in the heart of the monolith, where the spiral symbol glowed faintly, a single whisper could be heard, carried across the threads of reality. "I am here." The alien landscape remained still, bathed in the muted hues of its swirling sky. The crack that once scarred the monolith was gone, replaced by smooth, glowing stone. The spiral at its center pulsed faintly, as though it had a heartbeat, its rhythm echoing through the silent expanse. Miriam was no longer a figure walking across its surface. Her body was gone, her voice silenced, but her presence, her essence, was everywhere. She was the anchor now, woven into the very fabric of the realm. She could feel the threads of reality stretching out around her, connecting worlds she had never imagined. Each thread vibrated with life, shimmering with potential, and yet so fragile. The fracture she had caused was healing. The threads realigned slowly, carefully, like a weaver repairing a tapestry. Time, space, and existence began to settle, their chaotic energy retreating into order. Miriam had no sense of time anymore. No past, no future. She existed in a constant now, an eternal awareness of the threads that stretched beyond comprehension. She could feel the lives she had saved, the people in her world, the warden's realm, and the countless dimensions she would never know. But no one would know her. Back in Scotland, the Highlands were peaceful, untouched by the chaos that had unfolded beyond the gate. The wind swept through the heather, carrying the faint scent of rain. The ancient monolith stood as it always had, its carvings worn and weathered, a relic of the past. Angus McCall stood at a distance, his hat clutched in his hands. He had returned to the site a week after Miriam had vanished, unable to shake the guilt of leaving her behind. The stone looked unchanged, as if nothing had happened, but Angus knew better. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the damp grass. The wind whispered around him, soft and mournful. "Miriam," he murmured, his voice barely audible. There was no answer. He reached out to touch the stone, his fingers brushing against its cold surface. For a moment, he thought he felt something, a faint hum, deep and rhythmic, like the beating of a distant drum. Angus stepped back, his chest tight. He didn't know what had happened to Miriam, but he knew she wasn't coming back. "Rest easy, lass," he said softly, tipping his hat. The wind carried his words into the hills, where they were lost to the vastness of the highlands. Across the world, subtle changes rippled through time. In a small Parisian archive, a manuscript that once spoke of the stone gates was gone. In its place, another text sat on the shelf, its pages filled with vague accounts of ancient myths. No mention of gates or doorways, only whispers of forgotten realms. In an Edinburgh university, Miriam's name was erased from the roster of active researchers. Her colleagues didn't notice, their memories reshaped by the threads of reality. To them, she had never existed. And yet, in the quiet corners of the world, remnants of her story lingered. A faint hum in the presence of ancient stones. A fleeting spiral etched into the edge of a dream. A whisper carried on the wind, gone before it could be understood. Back in the warden's realm, the monolith pulsed steadily, its light glowing faintly in the dim landscape. The wardens stood in the distance, their forms flickering like shadows. "She has done well," one of them said, its voice resonating through the silence. "The balance is restored," another replied. For a moment, they remained still, their attention fixed on the monolith. And then they vanished, fading into the ether, leaving the realm in perfect stillness. Miriam existed within the threads now, a silent guardian of the balance. She had no form, no voice, no memory of what it felt like to be human. But every so often, a faint echo rippled through the threads, a reminder of the life she had lived, the choices she had made. And in those moments, somewhere deep within the spiraling fabric of reality, she felt a quiet sense of peace. Her work was done, her world was safe, and she was home. The Clockwork Office. Maxwell Hargrove didn't believe in fate, destiny, or anything remotely supernatural. He was an office manager at Dawson Logistics, a mid-tier supply chain firm in Chicago. His days were a never-ending loop of spreadsheets, conference calls, and caffeine-fueled attempts to stay awake through endless meetings. His office was on the 17th floor of a gray, nondescript skyscraper in the Loop. The windows overlooked a bustling street below, where people shuffled through their daily routines, just as he did. Everything about Maxwell's life was meticulously organized. His alarm rang at 6:30 a.m. sharp, his coffee was brewed by 6:45, and by 7 o'clock, he was on the train, buried in his phone. But on Monday, everything changed. It started with the clock. Maxwell arrived at his desk at 8:58 a.m., as he always did, setting his briefcase beside his chair and powering up his computer. The digital clock on his monitor blinked 8:59, and he waited for it to shift to 9 o'clock before opening his first spreadsheet. But it didn't. The clock stayed frozen at 8:59. Maxwell frowned, tapping the monitor as if that would somehow fix it. When that didn't work, he glanced at the wall clock across the room. It, too, was stuck. He checked his phone. 8:59. His pulse quickened as he looked around the office. His co-workers moved about as usual, chatting by the water cooler, typing away at their desks, laughing at someone's joke near the copier. Everything seemed normal, except for the time. "Did we get hit by a power surge or something?" he muttered, pulling open his drawer to grab his notebook. And then he noticed it. His notebook was open to a page he hadn't written. The handwriting was his, clear and neat, but the words were foreign to him. "Time is broken. Find the key." Maxwell stared at the words, his heart pounding. "What the hell?" he whispered, flipping back through the pages. Everything else in the notebook was normal: meeting notes, project deadlines, reminders to buy groceries. But that page... He glanced around the office again, his unease growing. The room felt different now, as though it were holding its breath. And then the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a faint dimming that Maxwell might have dismissed as a faulty bulb. But then it happened again, and this time, the flicker lasted longer. The overhead fluorescents buzzed loudly, their light shifting unnaturally, casting the room in shades of gray and white. Maxwell's co-workers didn't seem to notice. They continued typing, talking, and walking as though nothing was wrong. But Maxwell knew something was very, very wrong. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Does anyone else see this?" he asked, his voice louder than he intended. No one responded. He stepped closer to the nearest desk, where Karen from accounting was typing away. "Karen," he said, waving a hand in front of her face. She didn't react. Her fingers moved over the keyboard mechanically, her expression blank. Maxwell's stomach churned. He turned to another coworker, then another, but it was the same. They were all moving like puppets, their actions repetitive and devoid of thought. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, his voice shaking. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. The office plunged into darkness, and Maxwell froze, his breath catching in his throat. The only light came from his computer screen, which now displayed a single sentence in bold, glowing text. "Room 17B. Now." Maxwell stared at the screen, his pulse hammering in his ears. Room 17B was the storage room at the end of the hall, a place no one ever went unless they needed extra office supplies. "Room 17B, he whispered, the words sticking in his throat. The hallway outside his office stretched like a yawning abyss, the overhead lights flickering faintly in the distance. He hesitated, glancing back at the frozen figures of his co-workers. They wouldn't help him. Grabbing his phone for light, Maxwell stepped into the hallway. The storage room door loomed ahead, its surface dull and featureless. It looked the same as always, but something about it felt off. The air around it was colder, sharper, and the faint hum of machinery seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within. Maxwell hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He glanced back at the empty hallway, then steeled himself and turned the knob. The door swung open with a low creak, revealing a space that was impossibly vast. It wasn't the cramped storage closet he'd expected. Instead, it was a cavernous chamber filled with an intricate maze of gears, pipes, and glowing machinery. The walls were lined with massive clocks, their hands spinning erratically in every direction. Maxwell stepped inside, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing him in. At the center of the room stood a massive contraption, a clock unlike any he'd ever seen. It towered over him, its face a swirling vortex of light and shadow, its gears grinding together with deafening precision. He approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing against the metal floor. As he neared the clock, a voice filled the chamber, low and mechanical. "Maxwell Hargrove, you are out of time." Maxwell froze, his blood running cold. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the clock began to glow brighter, its vortex pulsing with energy. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. And then he saw it. A key. It hovered just above the clock's center, spinning slowly in the vortex. It was intricate and delicate, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. Maxwell reached for it instinctively, his fingers brushing the cold metal. The moment he touched it, the room exploded with light. Maxwell gasped as the light consumed him, blinding and cold. For a moment, he felt weightless, suspended in an endless void where the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a clock. It wasn't just in his ears. It was in his chest, his mind vibrating through his entire being. When the light finally dimmed, he found himself standing in a vast expanse that defied logic. The floor beneath him was a lattice of spinning gears, their golden teeth grinding together with mechanical precision. Above him, the sky, or what passed for a sky, was a swirling storm of numbers, clock faces, and shifting constellations of light. The air itself seemed alive, humming with energy. Maxwell turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of the impossible world around him. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ticking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His eyes fell on the key in his hand, its surface glowing faintly. The symbols etched into it pulsed rhythmically, almost as if the key were alive. Before he could process what was happening, a voice echoed through the expanse, a deep, mechanical tone that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the realm. "Maxwell Hargrove, welcome to the Nexus." He froze, his fingers tightening around the key. "Who's there?" "This is the heart of the timeline," the voice continued, ignoring his question. "The Nexus connects all moments, all realities, all possibilities, and you have disrupted its balance." Maxwell frowned, panic bubbling in his chest. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't do anything." "You exist as a paradox," the voice replied, its tone unwavering. "A fragment of a moment that should not be. Your presence has fractured the timeline, creating instability." Maxwell's pulse quickened. "Paradox? Fractured? Look, I don't even know how I got here. I'm just an office manager." The Nexus pulsed, the gears beneath him grinding louder. "Every action, no matter how small, has consequences. You are no ordinary manager, Maxwell Hargrove. You are an anomaly, an error that must be corrected." Maxwell stumbled back, his mind reeling. "Corrected? What does that mean?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the gears around him began to shift, their movement accelerating. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the swirling storm above grew darker, more chaotic. And then he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows of the Nexus, their forms humanoid but twisted, their bodies composed of fragmented clockwork. Their faces were smooth and featureless, their limbs jointed with gears and pistons that clicked and whirred as they moved. They surrounded him, their presence oppressive. "What are you doing?" Maxwell demanded, backing away. One of the figures stepped forward, its mechanical voice cutting through the air. "The timeline must be repaired. You must be removed." Maxwell's stomach dropped. "Removed?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm, its hand unfolding into a sharp, spinning blade. Maxwell's survival instincts kicked in. He clutched the key tightly and ran, his heart pounding as the figures pursued him. The gears beneath him shifted with every step, creating a labyrinth of moving machinery that threatened to swallow him whole. The Nexus seemed to twist and warp around him, the pathways of gears and cogs shifting unpredictably. Maxwell stumbled, nearly losing his footing as a massive gear spun beneath him. The figures followed relentlessly, their movements precise and unyielding. "Think, Maxwell," he muttered to himself, his breath ragged. There's got to be a way out of this. He glanced down at the key in his hand, its glow growing brighter with every passing second. The symbols on its surface seemed to shift, aligning into a pattern that he couldn't quite decipher. As he ran, the air around him changed. The ticking grew louder, almost deafening, and the storm above pulsed with light. Then, ahead of him, he saw it. A massive door, embedded in the framework of the Nexus. It was made of the same golden material as the gears, its surface engraved with intricate patterns that mirrored the symbols on the key. The door pulsed faintly, as if calling to him. Maxwell didn't think. He ran straight for it. The figures were closing in as he reached the door. Their mechanical limbs whirred and clicked, their blades gleaming in the dim light. Maxwell held up the key, its glow intensifying as he neared the door. The symbols on its surface began to rotate, aligning perfectly with the engravings on the door. Without hesitation, he pressed the key into a slot at the center of the door. The effect was immediate. The door flared with light, and a shockwave rippled through the Nexus, knocking the clockwork figures back. The gears around him ground to a halt, and the storm above dimmed, its chaotic movement slowing to a steady rhythm. The door creaked open, revealing a blinding void beyond. Maxwell hesitated, his heart racing. He glanced back at the figures, who were already regaining their footing, their featureless faces turned toward him. He didn't wait. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the door. When the light faded, Maxwell found himself standing in a new space. An expansive chamber that felt both ancient and futuristic. At the center of the room stood a massive, crystalline structure, its surface glowing with shifting patterns of light. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, and the air around it thrummed with energy. Maxwell's gaze was drawn to a series of floating symbols hovering around the crystal. They were the same symbols from the key, but now they were fully illuminated, their meaning just out of reach. "What is this place?" he whispered. The voice returned, softer now. "This is the core of the Nexus, the heart of the timeline." Maxwell took a hesitant step forward. "Why am I here?" "To restore balance," the voice replied. "The Nexus is unstable. The fracture must be sealed, or the timeline will collapse." Maxwell frowned, his chest tightening. "And what happens if it collapses?" "All moments will end," the voice said. "Past, present, and future will cease to exist." Maxwell's breath hitched. He looked at the crystal, its light pulsing steadily, and realized the truth. The key he carried wasn't just a tool. It was a solution, and he was the only one who could use it. Maxwell stood motionless in the vast chamber, his gaze fixed on the glowing crystalline structure at the center. The air thrummed with energy, its vibrations resonating in his chest. The key in his hand grew warmer, pulsing in rhythm with the light of the crystal. "The fracture must be sealed," the voice repeated, calm and unwavering. Maxwell's throat was dry. "How am I supposed to fix it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The symbols hovering around the crystal began to shift and rotate, their intricate patterns aligning and breaking apart in rapid succession. The light in the chamber dimmed, and images began to form in the air around him. Fragments of moments, glimpses of a timeline that no longer made sense. He saw himself standing in the office, staring at his computer screen. Then, he was on the train, scrolling through his phone. Another moment showed him as a child, playing with a small, toy clock. The images blurred, morphing into scenes he didn't recognize. A battlefield in the distant past, a futuristic city glowing with neon lights, a desolate wasteland where nothing seemed to live. "What is this?" Maxwell asked, turning in a slow circle as the images swirled around him. "These are the threads of the timeline," the voice said. "Each thread represents a moment, a decision, a possibility. Your existence has disrupted the threads, creating a fracture that spreads through all realities. Maxwell frowned, his chest tightening. I didn't ask for this. I didn't do anything. The voice paused, the symbols around the crystal flickering. Your paradoxical nature is not your fault, but your presence here has consequences. The fracture cannot heal unless it is sealed by the one who caused it. Maxwell's pulse quickened. What does that mean? What do I have to do? The crystal flared with light, and a pathway of glowing symbols appeared at its base, leading to a circular platform at its center. You must bind yourself to the nexus, the voice said. Your essence will stabilize the timeline, sealing the fracture and restoring balance. Maxwell took a step back, his eyes wide. Wait, bind myself? What does that mean? It means you will no longer exist as you do now, the voice replied. Your physical form will dissolve. Your consciousness will become part of the nexus, an eternal guardian of the timeline. Maxwell's stomach churned. You're asking me to give up my life? The voice softened. If you do not, the fracture will continue to grow. The timeline will collapse, and all existence will cease. Maxwell's mind raced as he stared at the crystal. He didn't want to die, or whatever this binding process entailed. He wanted to go back to his life, his routine, his normal, mundane existence. But the images swirling around him told a different story. He saw the chaos he had caused, the threads of time fraying and unraveling like a torn tapestry. Entire moments were vanishing, their light fading into nothingness. He thought about his coworkers, his family, the strangers on the train he rode every morning. If the timeline collapsed, they would all be gone. Maxwell clenched his fists. There has to be another way. There is no alternative, the voice said. The nexus requires stability. Without it, reality cannot survive. Maxwell looked at the key in his hand. Its glow bright and steady. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to whisper to him, urging him forward. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. And if I don't do it? The timeline will collapse, the voice repeated. There will be nothing left. No past, no future, no now. Maxwell's legs felt weak, and he sank to his knees. Why me? He whispered. Why did this happen to me? The nexus does not choose, the voice said. The fracture was an accident, a convergence of probabilities. But you are here now, Maxwell Hargrove, and you are the only one who can repair it. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the glowing crystal and the swirling threads of time around him. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, suffocating. Finally, he stood, his grip on the key tightening. I don't want to do this, he said, his voice trembling. The voice was silent. Maxwell swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. But I can't let everyone else pay for my mistake. The pathway of symbols pulsed faintly, guiding him toward the platform. With heavy steps, Maxwell followed it, his heart pounding with every movement. When he reached the platform, the key in his hand began to glow brighter, its light merging with the energy of the crystal. Place the key in the core, the voice instructed. Maxwell hesitated, his fingers trembling. He looked at the crystal, its pulsing light growing steadier, and then at the swirling storm of moments around him. This was it. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and placed the key into a slot at the center of the crystal. The moment the key clicked into place, the entire nexus erupted with light. Maxwell cried out as the energy surged through him, his body dissolving into particles of light. He felt himself expanding, stretching beyond the limits of his physical form. The threads of time aligned, their chaotic movements smoothing into a perfect, harmonious rhythm. The images swirling around him grew brighter, their colors vivid and alive. He was no longer Maxwell Hargrove. He was the Nexus. The office on the 17th floor of Dawson Logistics returned to normal. The clocks resumed ticking, and the frozen figures of Maxwell's co-workers came back to life, oblivious to the disruption that had occurred. No one remembered Maxwell. His desk was empty, his name erased from the company directory. To them, he had never existed. But the Nexus thrived, its balance restored. Across the threads of reality, subtle ripples echoed through time. A faint hum in the ticking of a clock, a fleeting sense of déjà vu, a whisper on the edge of a dream. And in the heart of the Nexus, where the crystal pulsed steadily, the faintest echo of a voice could be heard. The timeline is safe. The Nexus pulsed steadily, its crystalline structure glowing with an ethereal light. The storm of moments and threads that once swirled chaotically around it was now calm, each fragment of time moving with purpose and precision. The fracture was gone, the timeline restored. Maxwell no longer existed as he once had. His name, his face, his very essence had been woven into the fabric of the Nexus. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a presence, a silent guardian watching over the threads of reality. And though he had no form, no voice, no sense of self, a part of him lingered, a faint echo of the man he had been, tethered to the timeline he had saved. In Chicago, life went on. The 17th floor of Dawson Logistics buzzed with activity as employees shuffled papers, answered phones, and typed away at their desks. The office clocks ticked steadily, their hands moving in perfect synchrony. No one remembered Maxwell Hargrove. His desk was gone, replaced by a filing cabinet. His name no longer appeared on company rosters, and his co-workers went about their day as if he had never been there. But subtle traces of him remained. Karen from accounting paused by the water cooler, a strange sense of familiarity washing over her. She couldn't place it, but for a fleeting moment, she felt like someone was missing. Someone important. Down the hall, a new hire walked into the break room and stopped short, staring at the clock on the wall. It ticked normally, but something about it felt wrong, off, as though it were too precise, too perfect. And on Maxwell's old desk, buried beneath a stack of papers, was an old key. No one noticed it, its intricate symbols faint and nearly invisible. The ripples of Maxwell's choice spread beyond the office, reaching into the threads of reality he had repaired. A woman in Paris stood in an antique shop, drawn inexplicably to a collection of vintage clocks. She picked one up, a small, golden timepiece engraved with symbols she couldn't decipher, and felt a strange warmth in her chest. A scientist in Tokyo stayed late in his lab, scribbling equations on a whiteboard. He paused, staring at a clock on the wall as inspiration struck. The solution to a problem he'd been working on for years suddenly clear in his mind. A child in Buenos Aires sat by a window, watching the rain fall, and whispered to his mother, "I think time feels happy today." The threads of the timeline were whole, and though no one could name him, Maxwell's presence was felt in the quiet moments, the fleeting sensations, the sense that the world was just as it should be. Inside the Nexus, Maxwell existed beyond time and space, an eternal part of the system he had saved. He couldn't feel, couldn't think, but he was aware. He could see the threads stretching across dimensions, weaving together past, present, and future. He could sense the moments that made up existence, their vibrancy restored. And in the rarest of instances, when the balance wavered, he acted. A thread that frayed was guided back into place. A fracture that began to form was sealed before it could spread. A timeline on the brink of collapse was stabilized, its moments realigned. It was an endless task, an eternal vigilance. But Maxwell no longer felt the weight of it. He was the Nexus now, and the Nexus was him. In the heart of Chicago, the clocks ticked on. People moved through their lives, oblivious to the delicate balance that kept their world intact. But every so often, someone would pause, a fleeting thought crossing their mind, the sense that something or someone was watching over them. and in the hum of a clock, the steady rhythm of its ticking, a faint whisper could be heard, carried across the threads of reality. The timeline endures,